In the beginning, most people thought they knew what had happened. A 13-year-old girl had walked into the woods. The woods were vast. The woods were remote. And somewhere inside them, investigators assumed they would eventually find an answer. Months later, that assumption was becoming harder to defend. Search teams had covered thousands of acres. The FBI had deployed specialists. Leads had been pursued across the United States and into Canada. Yet the most important question in the case remained exactly where it had been on the first day. What happened after Stefanie Damron left home? What's striking about this case isn't a clue. It's the lack of one. It's because there isn't one. No publicly identified clue that explains where she went. No confirmed sighting that clearly extends her timeline. No discovery that neatly divides the investigation into a before and after. Just a 13-year-old girl who walked away from home on September 23, 2024, and never returned. To understand why investigators have struggled with this case, you have to begin long before the search. You have to begin with the place where Stefanie lived, and with a life that looked very different from most teenagers her age. Welcome to the Hidden Chapters, uncovering the truth behind every crime. The road to New Sweden, Maine doesn't feel like the road to somewhere. It feels like the road away from somewhere. The farther north you travel, the more the landscape takes over. Small towns become smaller. Homes become scattered. Cell service becomes less reliable. And eventually, there are long stretches where the forest seems to outnumber everything else. This is Aroostook County, a region so large that some visitors underestimate it the moment they arrive. That's easy to do on a map. It's much harder when you're standing in it. Somewhere inside that landscape sat the property where Stefanie Damron lived with her family. According to the FBI, the family lived on more than 20 acres and maintained a largely off-grid lifestyle. The children were homeschooled and spent much of their time on or around the property. In many missing person investigations, detectives begin by reconstructing a person's connections to the outside world. Who were they talking to? Who saw them recently? Where had they been? What digital records exist? For Stefanie, those questions were more complicated than usual. Investigators later described a family that largely kept to itself. Stefanie and her siblings had relatively limited interaction outside their immediate circle, and much of their daily life revolved around family and the land where they lived. Not because it explained her disappearance, because it made her harder to trace. Most teenagers leave a trail behind them without realizing it, or at least tiny pieces of information that investigators can use to rebuild a timeline. The public record suggests Stefanie left far less behind than most teenagers her age. Then there was something else. She knew the woods. According to law enforcement, Stefanie was familiar with the area surrounding the property and had previously spent time walking through the forest on her own. Investigators later said she was known to leave for hours at a time and return home without concern. Because when Stefanie disappeared, authorities weren't looking for a child lost in unfamiliar terrain. They were looking for a child who knew that terrain well. And that distinction changed everything. One of the most frustrating aspects of this case is how little separates the known from the unknown. Investigators can describe the beginning of September 23rd. They can describe the end of it. What happened in between is where the certainty starts to fade. According to information released by law enforcement and later statements from the family, Stefanie got into an argument with one of her sisters on September 23, 2024. Her parents were not home at the time. Other family members were present. The exact nature of the argument has never been publicly detailed. Investigators have never suggested that it holds the answer to the case. But it does mark the final confirmed turning point. Because after the argument, Stefanie left. She walked away from the house and headed toward the woods. Looking back now, it's easy to focus on that moment. In reality, it wasn't. Not to the people who knew her. For the people around her, none of this immediately stood out. Stefanie was familiar with the area around the property. She had spent time in those woods before. And according to investigators, it wasn't uncommon for her to be gone for a period of time and later return home. That's what makes the timeline so deceptive. There is no known witness reporting a struggle, no public report of suspicious activity, no publicly identified moment where everything suddenly changed, just a teenager walking away after an argument. If someone had watched her disappear into the trees that afternoon, there would have been little reason to believe they were witnessing the last confirmed sighting in the case. By nightfall, that ordinary walk would become the starting point of a mystery investigators are still trying to solve. As evening approached, Stefanie still hadn't returned home. If you enjoy true crime investigations like this one, consider subscribing. No one can say exactly when people stopped expecting Stefanie to come home. According to investigators, Stefanie's family did not immediately believe she was in danger. Given her familiarity with the area and her history of spending time in the woods, there was reason to expect she would return. At first, her absence fit a pattern everyone already understood. The problem was that the pattern eventually broke. The afternoon became evening. Evening became night. And Stefanie still wasn't back. A glance outside. A growing awareness that something no longer feels normal. By the following day, the situation had become serious enough that law enforcement was notified. Stefanie was officially reported missing on September 24th. At that point, investigators were immediately confronted with a practical problem. The last confirmed sighting was also the last confirmed piece of the timeline. There were no publicly identified witnesses placing Stefanie somewhere else. No publicly known activity extending the timeline beyond her walk into the woods. And that would become one of the defining challenges of the case. When a child disappears, the first days are often the most important. Authorities moved quickly. Maine State Police began investigating the disappearance, and within days, the FBI joined the case. In Stefanie's case, the Bureau deployed members of its Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, commonly known as CARD. The team specializes in major missing child investigations. As the search expanded, investigators began attacking the problem from multiple directions. Investigators worked to identify potential witnesses, establish timelines, and review information that might explain where Stefanie had gone. At first, the focus remained close to home. The last confirmed sighting placed Stefanie near the property. The challenge was the size of the area itself. The landscape surrounding New Sweden is not the kind of place that can be searched quickly. It's a region of forests, fields, logging roads, and vast stretches of terrain where visibility can change dramatically depending on location and season. The longer the search continued, the more difficult the case became. Finding Stefanie was not simply a matter of locating the right trail. Investigators first had to determine which trail mattered. Most missing child investigations gradually become smaller. As information develops, investigators narrow their focus. The Stefanie Damron case moved in the opposite direction. Instead of narrowing, it expanded. According to the FBI, investigators followed leads not only in Maine, but across the country and into Canada. Authorities were not working from one clear theory. They were exploring multiple possibilities simultaneously, and each possibility led somewhere different. And in Stefanie's case, publicly available information suggests investigators spent months evaluating information without finding the breakthrough that would redefine the case. The work never stopped, but the picture never fully came into focus. Then came another development. Months after Stefanie disappeared, authorities publicly announced a reward of up to $15,000 for information leading to her safe return or information leading to the arrest and prosecution of anyone involved in her disappearance. A witness who finally speaks. A memory someone previously dismissed. A conversation that suddenly feels important. Months into the investigation, authorities were still looking for the piece that would connect everything together. As the investigation continued, one fact became increasingly significant. Authorities were still unwilling to publicly commit to a single explanation. In many investigations, evidence gradually pushes detectives toward a likely scenario. Here, law enforcement repeatedly emphasized that multiple possibilities remained under consideration, because each explanation seemed to answer some questions while creating others. At the same time, extensive searches failed to provide the type of public breakthrough people expected. Then there was the investigation beyond Maine. That suggested authorities were considering scenarios extending well beyond the woods themselves. None of these details prove a theory, but together, they explain why investigators continued treating the case as open-ended. The more investigators learned, the harder the case became to explain. No single explanation publicly fit every known fact, and that reality would remain unchanged as the investigation entered its next phase. By the spring of 2025, the case had already been active for months. In May 2025, authorities returned to the area for renewed searches. More than 50 personnel participated, including members of the FBI, Maine State Police, the Maine Warden Service, and volunteer search organizations. Officials stated there had not been a major break in the case. Search conditions had changed. Winter had passed. The landscape looked different than it had during earlier efforts, so they searched again. And once again, the case continued without a public resolution. By that point, hundreds of hours had already been invested. Numerous interviews had been conducted. Search teams had covered enormous areas. Yet the central question remained unchanged. As time passed, the case became larger than the investigation itself. It became part of the community. In December 2024, residents gathered for a vigil marking roughly 90 days since Stefanie's disappearance. Community members displayed letters, flyers, and messages of support. Many wore purple, reported to be Stefanie's favorite color. Some of the people attending had never met her, but they were all asking the same question: where was Stefanie? And as months passed, people continued sharing information, discussing the case, and hoping for the development that would finally bring clarity. That development never came, at least not publicly. 1 year after Stefanie Damron disappeared, investigators were still working the case. Maine State Police and the FBI continued following leads and reviewing information. By September 2025, an entire year had passed without anyone publicly explaining what happened after Stefanie walked away from home. Long enough for seasons to change. Long enough for birthdays to pass. Long enough for people to assume there must be answers by now. But investigations don't operate on calendars. They operate on evidence. And publicly, the evidence had not produced a resolution. Authorities continued asking for information. The reward remained in place. The investigation remained active. Today, the story of Stefanie Damron is not remembered because of a dramatic breakthrough. It's remembered because there wasn't one. Somewhere between the last confirmed sighting and every search that followed lies the answer investigators have been trying to find since September 2024. Until that answer is found, the disappearance of Stefanie Damron remains exactly what it has been from the beginning: an unanswered question.
If this case stayed with you, you're not the only one. And if you're ready for the details most people miss, there's more waiting in the full Hidden Chapters playlist.